hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, so we're starting, Noam. It's a great privilege to have Professor Noam Chomsky today and Professor Bonnie Bassler. Professor Chomsky is going to go first, and I'm not going to introduce him because he's well known to us all at Columbia. He's been here many times, and we've all read his work over the years. And so I'm going to ask him right away to speak on the question of freedom and the entire background of why he thinks it's a mystery rather than a problem. And we've all read chapter 2 of his book, What Kinds of Creatures Are We? So we are prepped for the talk. So Noam, over to you.
Okay. I, in fact, will be talking mostly about background. I'll say a few words about freedom at the end after this discussion of what seems to me of background relevance. I'd like to begin with a distinction between two kinds of questions, what we may call problems and mysteries. More accurately, problems and mysteries for X, where X is a particular organism. So a relative concept of problems and mysteries. Problems lie within the cognitive capacities of X, in principle at least. Mysteries lie beyond these capacities. A version of the distinction is quite familiar in biology. So I happen to live in the desert. The ants in my backyard have minuscule brains, but they're capable of cognitive feats, navigation, for example, that are beyond the cognitive capacity of humans, who can match these achievements only with complex technology. Well, moving to organisms with more complex brains, rats can be trained to run many kinds of mazes, problems for them, but they cannot be trained to run a prime number maze, meaning turn right at each prime number choice. That's a mystery for rats, though not for humans, though very few humans would actually be able to solve the problem. Well, coming closer to home, our closest relatives in the animal world at an evolutionary distance of about 12 million years are capable of many cognitive feats, but not those of a human infant who can effortlessly acquire a language, in fact, several languages simultaneously, and do so on the basis of highly impoverished data that provides almost no evidence for what the
Sorry, this is getting back. They're getting back. Go inside. They have to get. They're getting feedback. One second.
I'll go back.
It's the front key from. Yeah.
Are we okay?
Now we are.
We're okay. It was, we had too many, we had two devices next to each other, not any longer.
Am I okay?
Yeah. Sorry.
So I was talking about chimpanzees, our nearest relatives, about 12 million years of evolutionary distance. They are smart animals, can do plenty of things. They can't do what a newborn human infant can do, which is acquire a language. In fact, maybe 4 or 5 languages simultaneously without attention, without training, without effortlessly. And they can do so on the basis of highly impoverished data, which provides almost no evidence for what they come to know. In recent years, experimental work has sharpened all of this, has shown that has greatly clarified the infant's achievement, what it actually knows at, say, 2 years of age, which is pretty remarkable. And it's also clarified the incapacity of a chimp even to begin the process. The NIM project, which is mentioned in the background reading, that's the clearest and fullest demonstration that even the barest rudiments of human language pose insoluble mysteries for an otherwise intelligent ape. I should mention that you can read, probably have read in the media, many excited claims about the linguistic achievements of apes, dogs, birds, other animals. The achievements are often quite real and highly illuminating, but on examination, they don't even have a remote relation to the properties of language, syntactic, semantic properties. It's a fact which poses puzzling questions about evolution of language, but is quite well supported by now. Well, on this matter, the dates in the background reading have been improved. There's now good evidence that the human faculty of language emerged pretty much along with Homo sapiens, very narrow window of time, and hasn't changed since, a couple 100,000 years. That too poses interesting problems, which I'll have to put aside. Well, excited claims go far beyond the alleged linguistic achievements of other animals. You may have read the lead article in the New York Times Magazine yesterday, which concluded with wonder, I'll quote it, GPT-3 and its peers have made one astonishing thing clear. The machines have acquired language. The ability to express ourselves in complex prose has always been one of our defining magic tricks as a species. Until now, if you wanted a system to generate complex, syntactically coherent thoughts, you needed humans to do the work. Now, for the first time, computers can do it too. Well, confusions about this matter abound, not only in New York Times editorial offices. So it's worth taking this apart for a few moments. First point, computers do nothing beyond executing programs. A program is a theory. To determine what a theory has achieved, we pose two kinds of questions. First, does the theory explain some interesting phenomena within its domain? Second, does it explain why other phenomena are outside its domain? So in brief, why X, why not Y? The second category is often overlooked, but mistakenly. We would, for example, not be too impressed if someone came up with a simple solution to the physicist's quest for a theory of everything. Here's the answer. I've solved it with a theory so elegant that it can be reduced to 2 words. Anything goes. That elegant theory accommodates all the laws of nature, whatever they turn out to be, and it accommodates all principles that violates the laws of nature. Well, sorry, no dice. That's GPT-3 in essence. and other systems like it. The computers, that is to say, the programs, acquired absolutely nothing. GPT-3 is trained on a 45 terabyte corpus of text, runs on one of the world's largest supercomputers, and it's able to mimic some superficial features of the immense database that it analyzed. And it would do just as well, in fact, often better, with an invented database violating all principles of language. In brief, it's as informative as the theory, anything goes. And a fair question is whether it's doing anything at all, apart from using a lot of California's energy. Its highly touted successor, GPT-4, which you'll probably read about in a later issue of the New York Times Magazine. This is going to have 100 trillion parameters. It'll use far more energy, and it will tell us just as much about language and human intelligence. That is, nothing. Well, to be fair, apart from polluting the atmosphere, these huge enterprises do achieve something. They improve brute force systems like Google Translator and live transcription, which are quite useful and are engineering triumphs, but tell us nothing about human intelligence, language, mysteries for humans, any other scientific question. Well, let's turn back to the effort to learn something about the world, in the present case about human intelligence. Going back to ancient history, that was the goal of the founders of artificial intelligence. First, Alan Turing, in his famous 1950 paper on machine intelligence, later Marvin Minsky, Herb Simon, and others. These goals have long ago been abandoned, apart from a fringe, though they do remain alive in cognitive science, which in the early days incorporated AI as an important subcomponent. Well, pursuing these goals, one major question is whether human intelligence is like other organic systems, including animal intelligence. Is it alike them in having scope and limits, which are logically related? The intrinsic capacities that yield scope also impose limits, as in the cases I mentioned. Well, as discussed in the background reading, the idea that humans are part of the organic world in this regard is ridiculed as what's called Mysterianism, some exotic departure from science. A better term, I think, is truism. Furthermore, truism that has been recognized by great figures of modern thought, back at least to Locke and Hume, who were reacting to the discoveries of Isaac Newton, discoveries which, in David Hume's words, drew the veil from some of the mysteries of nature, while also restoring nature's ultimate secrets to that obscurity in which they ever did and ever will remain. For humans, at least. He didn't add that. As Locke had put the matter earlier, quoting Locke, the judicious Mr. Newton's incomparable book, which had just appeared, has shown that matter has properties inconceivable to me, though God has put such powers and operations into bodies, and may also have superadded to matter the capacity of thought. It's called in the history of philosophy, Locke's suggestion. Locke's suggestion that thought is a property of some organized form of matter was developed extensively in the years that followed. At the same time, rich and important work on language largely identified thought with language. That's extending a tradition that traces back to classical Greece and India. Well, all of this was swept aside by 20th century behaviorist structuralist currents, which were regarded as highly scientific, but in my view at least, were radically opposed to the most elementary principles of science. The tradition, meanwhile, was totally forgotten. The linguistic tradition was resumed in mid-20th century, but in ignorance of what had come before. Locke's suggestion and its development was independently rediscovered in the last years of the 20th century. It was hailed as an astonishing discovery, a radically new idea in philosophy of mind and biology, actually presented in virtually the same words as the long forgotten tradition. There are some citations and references in the background reading. Well, all of this comprises an interesting chapter of recent intellectual history, perhaps with some useful lessons. Well, let's move on to explore what might be mysteries for humans. Go back to the Newtonian Revolution. The Newtonian Revolution, as Hume pointed out, eliminated the only concept of matter and body. Notice that these two notions were not distinguished, as the quotes I gave from Locke illustrate. When Locke, Hume, and others referred to matter and body in the post-Newtonian period, they meant whatever the world is constituted of. We don't know what, maybe beyond our cognitive reach. The great scientists of the day, Leibniz, Huygens, others, chastised Newton for reintroducing the so-called occult ideas of the neo-scholastics. That was the target of the 17th century scientific revolution. Newton himself partially agreed. He regarded his proposals as, in his words, an absurdity that no one with any scientific understanding could accept. But he argued that his absurdity was different from the hated occult ideas because it was formulated as an explanatory mathematical theory. Crucially, he emphasized not a physical theory, not a theory of matter and body. Such a theory remained beyond his reach despite extensive efforts for the rest of his life. Well, the longer term result was that science simply lowered its aspirations. It no longer sought to find an intelligible world. That was the dream of Galileo and his successors. Rather, it lowered its aspirations to seeking intelligible theories of the world, like Newton's theories. Newton's theories were intelligible to his harshest scientific critics, Leibniz and others, though the world they described was an absurdity, as Newton agreed. That implicit lowering of aspirations constituted a very important transition in the history of science, I believe, one with many ramifications discussed elsewhere, put it aside now. By the time we reached the 20th century, the transition had simply become scientific common sense, wasn't discussed anymore, and in ways that bear directly on the question of mysteries for humans. One case is the problem of consciousness, what's now called the hard problem. We should recognize that in the 17th century, there was also a hard problem. It's called The Hard Rock in Philosophy by Newton's predecessor, William Petty. The hard problem was to discover how properties of matter, whatever that is, account for motion. That problem was not solved. It was abandoned with the lowering of sights to discovery of the best theory to account for motion, something quite different. Consciousness was not a major topic in modern philosophy until fairly recently. A century ago, it did come to the fore in a version of Locke's suggestion. How could matter, whatever it is, yield thought? That's Locke. Now also including consciousness. That's Arthur Eddington. As Eddington formulated the problem, we know so little about matter that we cannot say that all matter is not conscious. Eddington was almost paraphrasing Newton, Isaac Newton, who speculated that, quoting him, spirit may be the cause of all movement in nature, including the power of moving our body by our thoughts. Knowing so little about matter, we cannot say that all matter is not alive. And as Eddington extended it, that all matter is not conscious. About the same time as Eddington, a century ago, Bertrand Russell, while dismissing the search for an intelligible world as ridiculous, observed that our highest confidence is placed in our immediate consciousness. Beyond that, our inquiries seek to account for what consciousness reveals. One of the things that inquiry discovers, that our immediate consciousness misleads us about the world, because experience conforms to the modes of cognition. Now, borrowing the terms of the 17th century cognitive revolution, later expanded by Kant, we can describe our consciousness in close detail, though we cannot say what consciousness is. And we know so little about matter that we cannot say that matter is not alive or even conscious. It's a problem about our ignorance of matter. More recent years, Galen Strawson has developed similar ideas extensively in his work on panpsychism. It's useful to compare the hard problem of the 17th century with what's called the hard problem today. Interesting comparison. So, how do we formulate a problem, easy or hard? The first and essential step is to state as clearly as possible what is to be explained. Having done that, we move on to seek an explanation. Well, that's how the hard problem of the 17th century was addressed. The first step was to say, here are the properties of motion. Then comes the search for explanation. How can these properties be explained in terms of what we know about matter? Answer, they can't. Then let's turn to a different problem, lowering our sights. Let's construct the best theory of motion that we can, and everything else that leads us to modern science. Today's hard problem is approached quite differently. Questions are posed, but they are unanswerable. Like, what is it like to be a bat? Or what is it like to see the sun set over the ocean? No one can answer the question what it's like. Maybe one can write poems about it, but there is no statement formulated that is subject to explanation. So in brief, the first step in formulating a problem is missing. There is no statement of the properties of what it's like. Therefore, it's impossible to proceed. One cannot provide an explanation for what cannot be formulated in a statement. That's true by definition. An explanation of X shows that X follows from the assumptions A. If you can't formulate X, there can't be an explanation. So it seems to me unclear whether there even is a hard problem of consciousness. That's quite unlike the 17th century hard problem, which was formulated in an answerable form, though not answered. Might digress for a moment and mention that it's now sometimes argued that Newton's problem has been solved by theories of relativistic theories of curved space-time or quantum theoretic approaches in terms of gravitons. That's a serious misunderstanding. The concepts in which these theories are framed are even more remote from the 17th century goal of intelligibility than Newton's absurd proposals. It's an important topic, insufficiently examined. We are no smarter than Galileo, Leibniz, Newton, and their contemporaries, and nothing has been learned to allay their concerns. We simply look elsewhere, and we can try to do the same with consciousness, develop the best theory we can to explain such phenomena as we can clearly formulate. So it looks to me, as you know, that's a small minority position. Well, there have been serious attempts to construct a theoretical account of experience in terms of qualia. The most rich and extensive is Nelson Goodman's structure of appearance. That doesn't seem to have entered into recent discussion. I suppose because it does not seek to answer the unanswerable question of what it's like. Well, let's turn finally to the main topic of these meetings, freedom, specifically freedom of will. A very curious topic. Everyone acts all the time as though they believe they have free will. People engage in discourse, they provide reasons, they go to a concert instead of working, they lift their finger, and so on. They always, 100% of the time, act as though they're choosing, maybe under constraints, but still choosing. Then comes a kind of paradox. While acting consistently as though they have freedom of choice, many profess that they do not, that free will does not exist. Well, we might ask, does it really matter what they profess if they always act in accordance with the belief that they do have free will? Another question is it a question of science? In fact, does science tell us anything about this? Well, not directly, it seems. There's a recent review of the state of the art, the Journal of the American Association for the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, Daedalus, review by two of the leading scientists who study voluntary motion, Emilio Bizzi, Robert Ajamian. They run through what is known, and then they conclude, as fancifully as they put it, that we are coming to understand the puppet and the strings, but the puppeteer remains an elusive mystery. In short, science has nothing to say. Science can deal with determinacy and randomness. That was understood in the 17th century, but it has no place for freedom of will. Well, that seems to leave us with two options. One is that free will does not exist. The science has nothing to say about the matter. The other is that contemporary human science is incomplete, perhaps irremediably so, if we are facing a true mystery for humans. Well, there has been sophisticated, illuminating work on moral responsibility, similar questions, but on the fundamental issue, it's not clear that we have progressed beyond Descartes' conclusion, quote him, even if the explanation of free and coherent choice of action lies beyond their reach or cognitive grasp, that's no reason to question the authenticity of our experience. Free will is the noblest thing we have. There is nothing we comprehend more evidently and more perfectly, and it would be absurd to doubt something we comprehend intimately and experience within ourselves, that the free actions of men are undetermined merely because it conflicts with something else, which we know must be by its nature incomprehensible to us. Well, that last phrase is too strong. We do not know that it is incomprehensible to us. All we know is that today's scientific knowledge has nothing to say about it. Maybe it is a true mystery, incomprehensible to us. Maybe there's something that will be discovered. Well, whatever the answer to that, we continue to act as though we have freedom of choice, and we continue to honor and respect those who devote themselves to protecting the precious gift of freedom and to expanding its reach. Thanks. Stop there.
Thank you, Noam. We'll start the discussion now. Bonnie, did you want to ask something? No? Later? Okay. Others? Yeah.
Thank you so much, Professor Chomsky. This is really interesting, and I wanted to ask about the example you gave earlier, this GPT-3 system, and just wanted to clarify what your thoughts are about it. Just with some quick background reading, I mean, I'm seeing that it can construct news articles and that are essentially indistinguishable. From real news articles, and human subjects aren't able to tell the difference between a composition made by this AI and something written by a human. And I understand what you're saying, that this doesn't mean that the AI is anything close to having human agency or choice, but I wonder, is your position that these systems can't be extremely influential in the hands of humans using them towards human agency and towards human ends? I'm thinking, for example, the capacity of some of these systems to automate massive compositional tasks that could be oriented towards a certain political goal, perhaps, and in our information environment, using that as a political weapon might be one example. And do you see potential for these tools to be used that way? Therefore, do you see them as a threat? And you seem like sort of dismissive of them. That's what I'm wondering.
I'm not dismissive of them as a threat. They are an engineering triumph. Engineering triumphs can be used in all sorts of ways. Like, I'm not opposed to bulldozers. I think they're great for clearing the streets instead of doing it by hand, but they're not contributions to science. And they can be used very harmfully, like they can be used for destruction and are used for destruction. So yes, these systems, which have precisely zero scientific interest, tell us nothing about language, nothing about thought, nothing about human intelligence, but they can be useful. In fact, I happen to be using them right at this minute. My hearing is not too good, so I'm using the live transcription. The live transcription is a brute force, totally brute force achievement of things like GPT-3. GPT-3, as I said, uses 45 terabytes of data on a huge supercomputer, and it's able to mimic some superficial aspects of human performance. Well, that helps to improve the brute force system of live transcription. Maybe it can be used in harmful ways too. I suppose it can. That's something always to worry about pure technology. But we should distinguish that from the raving account in the Times Magazine, which is totally false. Again, computer does nothing. The program does something, but tells us nothing about intelligence for a very simple reason. It's as much of a theory as the theory anything goes, literally. Accommodates all the phenomena, accommodates impossible phenomena. So it's telling us nothing about the world. Same with GPT-3, works just as well with data sets, huge data sets compiled from systems that are impossible for humans, not languages, does just as well for them. So by definition, it's telling us nothing about language or intelligence. It is an engineering accomplishment. That's fine, I'm all in favor of that, but let's not be confused about it. We should, as you said, be concerned about the misuses of technology. That's true of all technology, and it's true of this technology too. But let's just be clear about what we're talking about.
Thank you, Professor. Can I ask one more? Yeah, on the last part of your talk, I wanted to ask whether you had any personal normative or moral views on the subject of whether or not we should believe that free will exists. Do you have a take on this? Why do you have that take if you have one? Do you think we should sort of emphasize the fact that, you know, as human beings, we all seem to collectively agree and intuitively feel that free will exists, and therefore it does, and we should act like it does, and all the sort of consequences for life and society that produces? Or do you think we should be leaning more towards the fact that the science has nothing to say about it yet, so we should always adopt a very skeptical view?
Why can't we accept both positions? They're not contradictory. We can accept the fact that science has nothing to say about the topic, as is, I think, a fact. And at the same time, we can continue to act as we all do all the time, 100% of the time, acting as though I can decide right now, say, whether to lift my finger or not. And also in much more complex and consequential cases. We can act as we always do, with all that's involved in that, with the judgments of moral responsibility and so on. And in the back of our minds, we can take note of the fact that science can't tell us anything about it. All it can say is contemporary science can't accommodate it. Okay, that's the situation in which we live. We've accepted that for other things. Let's go back to the 17th century scientific revolution. As I said, Galileo, Newton, Leibniz were not morons. They were just as smart as we are. We've learned nothing relevant that they didn't know. They had a goal to try to show that the universe was intelligible, that it was a simple universe. Leibniz even had a kind of proof of this, the law of least action. arguing that all of nature seeks maximal effect with least effort. That's been well confirmed in the sciences. Alfred Einstein called it the magic creed. It always seems to work. When we understand something, turns out that it was the simplest possible way. Leibniz, the great mathematicians of the 17th century, Fermat, Descartes, had a proof of this. That's what leads to Leibniz's ridiculed conclusion that this is the best of all possible worlds, ridiculed famously by Voltaire, who didn't understand it. Leibniz had a serious argument for that. Well, anyway, that was the goal of the 17th century, to try to show that matter, in fact, conformed to this principle. And they had a concept of matter. It was called the mechanical philosophy. The world is constructed by a super architect who was doing things like the skilled artisans, who were creating complex clocks, the fountains at Versailles, puppet shows, other things, digestion by a duck, all sorts of things that seem very much like what humans and other organisms do. So that's an intelligible universe, one consisting of things that a super skilled architect could construct. That's Leibniz, Newton, their predecessors. Well, Newton showed there are no machines in this sense. That's basically what's demonstrated in the Principia. The world has no machines, no bodies. It has something, but we don't know what it is. It's at that point that science made this slow, implicit transition to abandoning the search for an intelligible world and moving to the search for best theories. Then goes on the way I described. So in answer to the question, I think we can accept all of these views. Going back to the original, we can accept the view that contemporary science, we've already accepted it implicitly for motion and body and matter. We don't have any concept of matter. It's whatever constitutes the world. So we've already accepted that we have no understanding of matter, of bodies, just whatever it happened, whatever it turns out there is, we don't have any understanding of it. And we don't even seek an understanding. We seek the best theory of it. I mean, take an extreme example, take John Wheeler, famous physicist at the Institute for Advanced Study. He's proposed a theory that's called it from bit. All that exists is answers to the questions we pose, bits. Everything else is a construction from that. I'm not competent to have any opinion about whether this is a viable theory, but let's suppose it is, okay? If it is, then what constitutes the world is answers to the questions we pose, okay? So be it, but we don't have any conception of it. That's the situation we're in. So why should we not be in that situation with regard to freedom of will? Yes, we act all the time as if we are able to make choices within constraints. All of our decisions and activities conform to that. In the back of our minds, we can bear in mind that contemporary science tells us nothing about it. And maybe that's sort of like the constitution of matter, what constitutes the world, a mystery that's beyond our capacity, just as prime number mazes are mysteries for rats, or learning a language the way an infant does is a mystery for apes. That's the way organisms are. If we're organisms in the world, not angels, presumably true for us too, even if we don't like to think about it.
No, can I just ask if you say both these claims are consistent, but would you resist what some philosophers would say, which is that freedom is just by the kind of concept it is, if we think we possess it, we do possess it. Is that something you would resist?
Definitely, because it's false. Just because we think something exists doesn't show that we possess something, doesn't mean that we possess it. Of course not. So of course I'd reject it, but I don't think it has anything to do with the question. The question is the following. I'll repeat. We are in the following situation. We all act 100% of the time as if we have freedom of choice. We make our judgments that way. We interact with each other that way. We provide reasons, assuming that we make moral judgments and so on. That's 100% of the time. Off in a corner, we recognize that science can't tell us anything about it. There's a further question that we don't know how to answer. Is the incapacity of science to tell us something about it just a limitation of contemporary science, which of course is incomplete in many ways, or is it more deep? Is it an indication that this is a true mystery for humans, like the nature of matter and body seems to be a true mystery for humans, something we've accepted for hundreds of years? Is this another one? Well, we don't know, but I think it's a plausible conclusion. But I don't think the philosopher's remarks that you mentioned before bear on this question.
Uh-huh. Ellen?
So I think you sort of already answered my question just now, but my question was, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can read you. That's what matters.
All right.
Thanks to GPT-3.
You think that we might be able to determine the limits of admissible hypotheses that Pierce discussed for both our science forming capacities and for those that enter into common sense understanding? And you mentioned in that chapter that those two capacities may have different properties. I was wondering if you thought that the fact that the sciences appear ill-equipped to produce a concept of a body is a possible illustration of an admissible hypothesis of common sense understanding that can't translate into an admissible hypothesis of the sciences, or if we should be thinking about it, I guess, in the other way, which is sort of what you've been suggesting.
Yeah.
Just
That's a very important question. Going back to Peirce, that's his concept of abduction, which has been seriously misunderstood. Now, the crucial part of it is what you said. For Peirce, abduction puts a limit on possible hypotheses. And if it weren't for that, we could never learn anything in ordinary life or in the sciences. It imposes a sharp limit on possible hypotheses. He reviewed many episodes in history of science, and he pointed out something that is in fact quite striking. At particular moments of the history of science, a number of people come close to the same answers. That was true of relativity theory, for example, after his time. Others were very close to Einstein's proposals, and there are many other such cases. Peirce argued the reason is we all share the same internally determined, innately determined conditions that limit hypotheses. We can only entertain certain ones, not others. Peirce argued that this will lead us to truth, but he argued that on the basis of a misinterpretation of evolutionary theory, which was Darwin's theory, which was quite common, still is quite common in many areas. The belief that somehow natural selection would have created an organism which is for which the admissible hypotheses are the true ones. Natural selection would do this. Absolutely no reason to believe that. Natural selection pays no attention to outcomes. It's a misunderstanding of natural selection. Natural selection just says the better reproducing organisms proliferate. Could lead to this condition, could lead to another one. Evolution is what's called hill climbing. Moves up a hill, can't go down, may have gone up the wrong hill. And there's another one out there that evolution just didn't happen to hit, so too bad for the organism. So that argument doesn't work. But Peirce's main point, that there is some intrinsic internal directive that leads us to admissible hypotheses for language learning, for any other kind of learning, for science, something like that, I think, has to be correct. David Hume had said something pretty similar when he talked about his sort of solution for the problem of induction was just, we have an animal instinct which directs us to connecting impressions, even though there's no connection between them. Can't do any better than that. That's just the way organisms work. We can't improve on that. But I think it's pretty much where things stand. And it does, I think, lead us to expect that humans are like every other organism with scope and limits. That is the heresy of Mysterianism, or as I would prefer to call it, truism. Going back to freedom of will, that's one of the cases. May will, we don't know, may will lie beyond our capacity for our range of admissible hypotheses, just as acquiring a language like an infant is beyond the capacities of a chimpanzee in principle. No possible training.
Thanks.
Professor, accepting mysteries, not just in questions of existential meaning, but also in questions of physics and scientific knowledge, seems to provide a sort of scientific, biological underpinning for philosophical absurdism. If some even science is unknowable, should that change the way we ought to see ourselves or to behave? I just wonder if you have any thoughts on how the distinction between problems and mysteries might affect the idea of absurdity.
Well, I think it should. So there's simple cases. Take the one I mentioned, consciousness, our immediate conscious experience. As Russell said, that's what we have the highest confidence in that. My highest confidence is that I see a group of people sitting in a room. Nothing I could be more confident than about that. Well, it happens, as Descartes already understood, that that's a very complex construction by the mind of scattered stimuli, which, if for a mind not constituted like ours, wouldn't be anything. Okay, our minds happen to be constituted in such a way that our scattered stimuli lead us to a conscious experience of people sitting in a room, although all we're getting is, dots of scattered stimuli on the retina. Well, we now know a lot about that. Saccadic eye movements, your eyes are moving around rapidly, randomly all the time, picking up points of light. The mind is immediately constructing lines, angles, geometrical figures, organisms, and so on, all going on in the mind. But maybe out there, what's out there is something totally different. It could be puppets, let's say, or maybe some heads, but no bodies, all kinds of things. As the 17th century Neoplatonists, Cudworth, others pointed out, our experience conforms to our mode of cognition. So what we see, think, what we have confidence in can often be incorrect. You know, the moon, in fact, that's what illusions are. The moon illusion, the bent stick illusion, and so on. It's what we see, but not what's there. So yes, there are many cases like this. And it can reach to cases of real human significance, like what's the nature of freedom of choice? What are we striving for when we try to advance the cause of freedom and inhibit or overcome barriers to it? And what are we actually doing? Well, we do it, but try to spell it out, we haven't got much to say. We're mostly acting on instinct.
One last question.
Hi, Professor Chomsky. Thank you very much for that presentation. My name is Ovidia Stenoy. I'm a PhD student in the psychology department. And I have a question about the role of theories in our work as trainees. So I'm particularly thinking in psychology and in economics. You know, as graduate students, we're taught to develop theories and then test them in our lab. However, recently, I feel like particularly in economics, there has been kind of a pushback against that, kind of an empiricist movement to say, it's okay if we don't have theories, we can observe. And then once we make certain observations, you know, develop, you know, come up with theories based on those observations. And I think this is all inspired from, it's inspired by movement, I guess, applications in the medical field, right? Where people experiment with different treatments. And then if they find a treatment that works in certain diseases, then they say, okay, now we can start understanding the mechanisms of certain diseases. So I feel like there's this push to kind of take that approach also in economics, in psychology, in fields where we're interested in human behavior. So I guess my question to you is, what is your advice to us as trainees in terms of developing theories and coming up with good frameworks for how the world works as we're trying to answer some of these hard questions, but also kind of going out in the world and exposing ourselves to possibilities that are beyond our just our theories?
Well, in the actual world, we always behave like this and properly. So for example, when I go to see my cardiologist, he gives me various advice about all the kind of things I should do and not do, what pills I should take, and so on and so forth. If you look into it, there isn't much theory behind this. It's just the experience of what seems to have more or less worked most of the time, changes every once in a while. So what you were told one year, you're told not to do the next year. Okay, that's the nature of science. You don't know a lot, so you do the best you can. Makes perfect sense. I wouldn't argue against that, even if there's no theory. But there's a deeper point about psychology. Remember that psychology in the 20th century made a sharp departure, radical departure from science. It's called behaviorism. And it still is highly influential. What is behaviorism? Let's take, since many of you are philosophers, let's take the way it was understood by the leading philosophers, like Quine, for example, leading philosopher of language and mind in the 20th century. For him, all of behavior is just conditioning. In fact, operant conditioning. When you construct a theory, the theory is just a collection of statements connected to each other by association and established by connected to stimuli by conditioning. That's what a theory is. That's so utterly remote from reality that we have to ask ourselves how philosophers could have taken this seriously. Just think about it for a minute. Physics is a system of statements established by conditioning and associated to stimuli by conditioning. I mean, it's not even worth commenting on. In the 17th century, you talk about occult ideas was more reasonable. Language was treated the same way by linguists too. And in fact, behaviorism as an idea is based on the principle of rejecting science. The essence of science was described pretty accurately, I think, by Nobel laureate in physics, Jean-Baptiste Perrin, who pointed out that the essence of science is to discover the simple invisibles that lie behind the complex visibles. That's what you're doing when you carry out an experiment. An experiment is a radical abstraction from experience designed in order to throw out the complex visibles that don't matter somehow and to find the hidden invisibles that lie behind them. Behaviorism was saying, as a point of principle, you can't do this. We have to keep to the complex visibles. You're not allowed to look at the internal systems that guide and control behavior. You can only look at the manifestations and, put them together in one or another way and so on. That's a radical departure from science. And I think it's been extremely harmful. Kind of interestingly, it's coming back through Silicon Valley, things like GPT-3. It is now possible to look at huge masses of data very quickly with supercomputers and find some patterns in them. That can sometimes be useful. For example, it was useful in determining what goes on with the protein folding part problem. So just brute force can sometimes give you interesting data. It's useful. But what it's led to is a belief of the kind that you mentioned. We don't need theories anymore. We can just take what we find in huge quantities of data and we can apply it. And that's it. Who needs a theory trying to account for what's going on? In my view, that's total madness. But you can read it even by now in scientific journals. It's part of the temptations that are given misleadingly by the capacity to use incredible amounts of data. I'll just finish off with an anecdote that's attributed to John von Neumann, whose biographies are much in the news now. I don't know if nobody knows if it's accurate, but the story is that Freeman Dyson, famous, a young physicist at the time, came to von Neumann and had an idea that he wanted to show von Neumann, and he showed it to him, and von Neumann asked him, how many parameters are there in your system? And Dyson said, I don't know, maybe 100 parameters. And von Neumann told him, with 4 parameters, I can conjure up an elephant. With 5 parameters, I can make it wiggle its trunk. Go home and try to find out what's going on. Well, whether the anecdote is true or not, it points to something serious. If you want to understand the world, don't just get lost in huge quantities of data and look for something in it. Maybe you'll find something. And in particular, if you really want to understand the world, be wary of systems that are of the kind anything goes. I can match this data. I can match impossible data. That's getting nothing. If we're interested in understanding the world, of course, also for practice.
Okay, thanks very much, Noam. We're going to now ask Bonnie Bassler to speak.
Yes. First of all, thank you, Noam, for your talk and your responses to the questions are always fascinating. It's my pleasure actually to introduce very, very briefly, because she too really doesn't need much of an introduction, Bonnie Bassler, who is the chairman of the Department of Molecular Biology at Princeton, also a Howard Hughes Institute investigator. She has won virtually every honorific award that is imaginable. She's a MacArthur Fellow, every national academy she's a member of. And she and her students have, and colleagues have discovered the phenomenon of quorum sensing. And she will probably be talking a bit about that this afternoon. I just want to welcome her to Columbia. She's a friend and a really great scientist. I don't know, are you ready, Bonnie? Or are you? Anyway, it's a pleasure to have her at Columbia. And thanks for coming. And she will be talking about certain cell-to-cell communications, I suspect.
Anyway, thanks. Can they hear me? They can hear me. They told me this one is good. Can they? You can. They can hear it. Okay, good. Anyway, thanks, John. So I'm delighted to be here too. I'm going to go a little bit before the 17th century. I'm going to start 4 billion years ago with this. And I think what I want to do is to make sure that I'm really clear. I don't think this is language. I think this is communication, right? So I think there's going to be something fundamentally different about these. There's going to be a lot different about these two talks, but I'll start there. So the question, so I'm a scientist, an experimentalist, and the question that my lab always wants to understand is how bacteria, which are the world's most ancient, most primitive, tiniest living organisms, how do they get any bang for their buck? Yeah, okay. So just to start, what I've done here is just put a couple of, put some pictures under a microscope. These are famous, notorious, terrible bacteria that can cause disease. And these are wonderful bacteria on the bottom that are in our microbiome that actually give us all kinds of products that keep us alive. And so what we know as facts now is that bacteria can kill us, right? Or they can give us life, okay? But they're puny. And so the question that's at the heart of my lab study is how can they do either of these things, harmful or beneficial? How can they do it? And so what we've shown is that the way bacteria get to do these powerful things is by communicating with chemical words, by counting their numbers, and by recognizing when they have the right number of cells together. If they all do something simultaneously, they can accomplish feats that they could never accomplish as individuals, because individually they're too small to make a difference. And so that process is called quorum sensing. And so on this first cartoon, I'm going to show you how it works. So bacteria have to figure out, are they alone or are they in a group, so they can behave appropriately. And so the way that they do that is by making and releasing small molecules that I have as red triangles, and I'll use symbols throughout my talk, that are like hormones or pheromones, and we call them autoinducers. So when bacteria are alone, the world is big, bacteria are small, so they make these autoinducers, these hormones, and they diffuse away. The bacteria can't detect them, and that says act as an individual. So they carry out some subset of the tasks they're capable of doing, but ones that each bacteria individually can accomplish the task. But as bacteria grow and divide in the environment, all of the cells are making a share of this hormone molecule. The amount of the molecule is increasing outside of the cells in proportion to cell number. And when that molecule hits a particular threshold amount, the bacteria detect it, and they infer from that detection event that they must have neighbors around. And so in unison, all of the bacteria change their gene expression or their behavior together. And they begin to carry out collective or group behaviors, tasks that it takes lots of cells doing them together to make the task successful. Right? So they're using the concentration of these molecules as a proxy for cell number. So the real truth is they have no idea how many cells are around them. They believe, if you will, that these molecules say something about the number of cells. And we know that that's true because we can collect up these molecules and just dump them on these dilute cells, and they'll do all the group behaviors, right? So they're just measuring the molecules and behaving, right? So that we now call quorum sensing, and it's sort of a form of voting, right? They vote, they count the vote, and then they go along with this decision-making process about what tasks they're going to do. All right, so don't worry, I really want you to see these molecules, right? Because what we now know is that it takes at least 3 chemical words, if you will, to have a proper quorum sensing conversation. So what we discovered is that there's, in each species of bacterium, there's always a molecule. And so I show in this one for a particular species, there's a molecule that, as far as we can tell, that species and only that species makes that molecule. So we think this word or this language is for intra-species communication. This is how I count my siblings. Then there's a molecule we discovered, this long one, that all bacteria in a species, in a genera, like a whole family, will make that molecule, but nobody but that genera, like all Vibrios make it, but nobody but Vibrios make it. So we think this is like the genus. This is like, I'm your cousin. This is like, the top one is, I'm your twin. Right? Then the third molecule we discovered is broadly made by all bacteria as far as we can tell. So there's no species information in it. They all make exactly the same molecule. So we think this molecule says other. Right? So now for the rest of my time, I will use symbols. So I'm going to color code them. The red one is self, the blue one is the family, and the green one is other, perhaps the enemy. And so the computation that we think bacteria have to do is they not only have to count how many cells are around, they have to know who those cells are so they can behave appropriately. So they do a little mathematical computation. So the bacteria are in this wild west world. There's all these molecules floating around made by the different bacteria. And what we think they do is actually kind of simple. They just make a numerator and a denominator. And they ask, how many of the red ones over the total. So in this, if a bacterium found itself swimming around with these molecules, it would be like, okay, there's 10x of the self molecule, there's 3x of the cousin molecule, and 2 of the other molecule. So the bacterium would infer, this is mostly my kin. So I will carry out tasks, group tasks A, B, and C, because I'm surrounded by my kin. In another situation, maybe mostly the blue molecule is there. Okay, so there's a little bit of myself, there's a lot of my cousins, and there's a few other. So in that case, the bacterium will infer, if you will, it's mostly my cousins. And so then perhaps it will carry out A and B. Like I will do particular group behaviors, and these are kind of my related family, but they're not my clones. So I don't actually like my cousin as much as I like myself. So I'm not going to give away this goodie, but I'll do a few of these things. Right, and then you get it. The third scenario is you're mostly surrounded by other, perhaps the enemy. So in that case, perhaps the kinds of behaviors the bacteria do is B. Like there are always behaviors you must do when you're in a group. It doesn't matter who that is. But then instead of beneficial behaviors, they'll turn on defensive behaviors because you're surrounded by perhaps the enemy. Okay, so what I'm trying to tell you is that in this simple way, what bacteria do is the following computation. I think the first thing they ask is, am I alone or am I in a group? And they begin to carry out behaviors. They have thousands of genes, thousands of possible behaviors to do. So they just sort of decide that first. Then the second thing they do is they scan the environment for these quorum sensing molecules and they ask, is it me or is it the enemy? And then they tailor the kinds of behaviors they turn on based on who's winning and who's losing in any given consortium, right? So these molecules then say something about cell number, but they also say something about how closely or distantly I am related to the neighbor, and the bacteria do something about that information. So they're actually computing, and there's a lot of information in these molecules. Okay, so they're also communicating, right, with these molecules and doing these computations.
I'm just.
Okay, so now you get it, right, that these bacteria communicate and they count and they take a census of the environment with these molecules. And so that is all hunky-dory if one wants to cooperate. So you can imagine that in the real world, not in a flask in Princeton, right, there's all kinds of bacteria and other organisms in these environments, right? They're all contributing these molecules. And the benefit of quorum sensing, besides being able to carry out group activities, is that bacteria can cooperate with one another. And that's the difference between subsistence farming and New York City, right? So because they can monitor one another's presence, right, and they can cooperate, then they can specialize. And so instead of having to do every single job by yourself, like a subsistence farmer, they can be tracking one another's cell density and who the neighbors are, and then they do specialize. There's the car mechanic, there's the grocer, there's the laundromat. And so the place where you might know it is on your teeth in the morning. Every morning you wake up with that gunk. That is New York City of bacteria. That's called a biofilm, and there are 600 species there, right? And they are each doing their different jobs. You get a cavity, they get food, right? But they are specialized and they can't do it without each other, because one guy does jobs A, B, C, the other guy does D, E, F, the other guy, and then the whole community flourishes. Okay, so we know there's cooperation, and the quorum sensing mediates those kinds of interactions, and that's been going on for billions of years. So that's fine, except that the world is always not so nice and cooperative. So there's many genomes, many processes, right? So now you get it, right? That's how quorum sensing works. But the problem for bacteria, and they have to solve problems with communication that are really similar to the ones that we have to solve. So the problem is that many of the products that are controlled by quorum sensing are what are called public goods, which I think you guys are philosophers, so you already know what those are, right? So bacteria, they're tiny, right? And if they need to eat some large, substrate, they have to put an enzyme out, chew it up, and get biteable bites that they can take back in, right? So they have to put things out into the world, right, and let them go, and they also have to get the products back. And so that's really dangerous, right? Because the second you let it go, it's not yours, it's a public good. So on my cartoons, I have all these goodies, right, that they're making food and money and, things, right? In these cases, they're actually molecular, right? And the question, and then the problem with that is that when you're not just with your own kin, is that these products, public goods that everybody gets the benefit, right? Because they're all working together to make the public good, and then they're benefiting from those public goods, they can get stolen. It's simple, right? They're in mixed species consortia. And so, I don't know, for example, this green guy gets your Bitcoin, right? Because it was just laying out there. It's just like you leave your bike out in the front lawn. If it's not locked, it's not there the next morning, right? And so this is happening all over the bacterial world, that these bacteria are simply stealing from one another, right? And then benefiting, okay? And then there's actually, so there's just stealing, like just taking, but there's actually all kinds of fantastic trickery and cunning and even more sophisticated mechanisms for bacteria to steal from one another than just taking. And so I put a few examples that we know the molecular details, because I want to try to make the analogies that the way trickery and thievery and eavesdropping happens in the bacterial world is analogous to what happens in our world with public goods and communication. So I'll just take a couple of examples, and again, they're going to be like the ones that you deal with every day. So there's what I would call code crackers, right? So here's this guy, right? He's trying to communicate with this stealth molecule, right? And when that organism or that bacterium has enough neighbors present, right? Quorum sensing occurs. In my cartoons, it turns purple. It's making all these public goods. It's doing all these group behaviors. So there are bacteria in the environment that have evolved enzymes, right, that they also release. And those enzymes are very specific to cleave the chemical molecules that the maker needs to communicate with. And what's amazing about these is that they are incredibly specific. So what happens to the maker, right, is it undercounts, right? If your molecule disappears, you're trying to monitor the concentration of the molecule. If the molecule disappears, you're not counting correctly, right? And so we know how these enzymes work. They're specific for each chemical word. So the green guy, for example, can cleave this molecule here. So it cuts the ring off the chain. It's not, there's no information in that molecule once that happens. But we know that there are many examples of these. So some that open the ring, some that cut in a different place. And so the idea that we have about these is that these are very specific competitive interactions. So the green bacterium does not evolve an enzyme that clips up molecules from bacteria it's never encountered before, right? These bacteria live in the same environment. They're competing for the same nutrients. And so there are dozens and dozens of these enzymes known, but they're very specific for the chemical word that each one hydrolyzes or cleaves. So we think that means that these species have evolved together, for billions of years, sort of duking it out, trying to get these public goods. So those are code crackers. There's also spammers, right? So let's take my gray bacterium, right? That is used to communicating with the red molecule, the self molecule, right? Well, there are bacteria that have evolved that make mimics, right? So if the blue bacterium, the one that wants to cheat, makes a molecule like the self molecule, the red triangle, and it floods the environment with that molecule, the receiver, the bacterium that believes, if you will, that it's supposed to communicate with that molecule is going to overcount. And it's going to turn on quorum sensing when it doesn't have the quorum. So it starts spewing out all of these public goods. It and its kin are not at high enough numbers to take advantage. So the blue guy, then in this case, the cheater, gets the benefit and the maker loses. So there's many examples of cheating, downright stealing, code cracking, spamming, misinformation, fake news, if you will. So that's from the cheater side, but then it's an arms race. And so the bacteria that need quorum sensing to carry out group behaviors have also evolved all kinds of mechanisms to privatize these public goods. They have to protect these expensive goods from cheating. And so there are little molecular police, if you will, that have evolved to keep these goods for the maker. And so I'm just going to go through a couple examples of those. And again, I think these are really like the ones that we do all the time. So when you try to log in, right, or when you go to your bank, you get the code, right, and you have to do two-factor authentication, right, in order to access, your money, right? So the bacteria have evolved an analogous strategy for protecting public goods. So I'll go through how this works. All right, so you get my cartoons. The gray guy will do quorum sensing when there's the right amount of molecule around, presumably the right amount of kin around, right? It's going to turn purple, meaning quorum sensing. All right, so let's say there's a kin bacterium there, right? So this guy, the left one, is making molecules. And remember, I've told you that they usually use multiple molecules. So in this case, I'm just saying the bacterium uses two. So let's say it makes the red molecule, which is the self molecule, and the green molecule, which is the other molecule. So that's the maker. So the receiver is going to try to decide, if you will, should I enact quorum sensing? Should I make hundreds of public goods that are very expensive? So what it does, what these bacteria do, is that they have and/or switches. And so what I mean by that is that if the receiver, in this case on the right side, detects the red molecule and the green molecule, right? So it does two-factor authentication. Okay, that's probably my kin or my cousin. So it turns on quorum sensing and it begins to make public goods. Remember, we had these other bacteria that were these spammers, right? So there are bacteria out there that make quorum sensing mimics. So in this case, the gray guy is trying to decide, am I going to enact quorum sensing? I'm going to turn on all these public goods. So it's scanning the environment for molecules. And sure enough, if that cheater that can make the red kin molecule is there, the receiver will detect it. The receiving bacteria will detect it, but it's asking, where's the second molecule? Where's the second molecule? Where's the second molecule? Not there, because it's a cheater. And so in this case, the bacterium will not turn on quorum sensing, right? So they actually have a sort of two-hit to the detector. It's exactly what you do when your bank asks you to authenticate yourself, and it sends you a code. You put the code in, and then you have access, right? So it's exactly analogous to that. So that's one of the strategies that bacteria have evolved to avoid being cheated. A second one is to make self-destruct messages. So again, in my cartoons, the purple bacteria is counting, it's releasing molecules, the red molecules. When the molecules hit the appropriate concentration, it means that there's the right number of cells there, and they're gonna make public goods. Very often, these molecules have information for the maker. But if there is a cheater in the environment and that cheater detects, binds the molecule, it actually has a toxin in it. So if a cheater tries to take advantage, in fact, they're killed. So the maker has immunity. They actually have, just like you get a vaccine against poisons, right? These bacteria make the molecule and they have immunity to the toxin, but cheater receivers get killed. And so that's a good way to keep cheaters from taking advantage of the public goods. And then a third way, and this is a really common way, and again, it's this, is to use secure lines. So you get this idea in all my cartoons that when bacteria are floating around and these molecules are floating around and these public goods are being released, it's really simple for cheaters to either take them directly or to eavesdrop and take advantage. And so what bacteria often do is that they encase themselves in sort of a suit of armor, right? In what's called, because they don't want these things taken away from them. So they encase themselves in sort of a suit of armor. It has three benefits. The first is that as they grow and divide, you're obviously next to your kin because you're right next to your babies because everybody's encased in what we call a biofilm, attached to a surface and encased. The other thing is that the public goods are sequestered inside. So you're automatically next to your kin, your babies, right? The public goods are there. That's who you want to share with. So they keep them inside. And then the third advantage of these is that they really are covered in a tough extracellular matrix. And so the cheaters can't sort of bounce off. They can't actually enter it. So it's sort of like they have a moat around them. And so this is the thing that I told you that is on your teeth every morning. It's called a biofilm, right? It's that thick, filmy stuff, and that the bacteria cover themselves with, and it keeps groups of bacteria close to one another. So you're in proximity with your kin, you're in proximity with the public goods, they can't escape, and it also protects you from invaders, right? And so that's a super common strategy because it has all of these benefits. So then the goal, I think, for the bacteria is to communicate with sets of words, right, that tell them something about the neighborhood, right? And it's a really messy world. You know, there are probably hundreds of millions of species of bacteria, right? We have no idea how many of these communication molecules there are, but we know that bacteria live in these complex consortia, and they have to make sense of those environments in order to behave as individuals or behave as groups. And so even with all the messiness that I'm telling you about, what they're really trying to do is sort of have elections, right? They're just voting. They're trying to tally the vote. In this case, the vote are these chemical words, right? And then decide what is the right thing to do based on getting accurate information in the face of all of this noise or cheating and free riding, right? But it works because quorum sensing, somehow it works because quorum sensing is the norm in the bacterial world. There are thousands and thousands and thousands of cases of quorum sensing been discovered. It seems to be a really early moment in evolution when bacteria changed from only being able to do individual behaviors to being able to do collective behaviors. That was a transformative leap, you know, to be able to do things as a group. And so even with the mess that I'm telling you about, somehow they must mostly be able to get accurate information because these behaviors persist, you know, through evolutionary time. But of course, it's not over, right? Evolution is still happening. So that's sort of research and development in the cartoons that I'm telling you about. So bacteria are constantly, you know, just by trial and error, and you already heard that in Dr. Chomsky's talk, you know, they're evolving new molecules, new words, new ways to distinguish self from other. And then likewise, their competitors are evolving new ways to free ride, to cheat, to eavesdrop, and to trick, right? So it's constantly going on, right? And there's going to be many more of these mechanisms to learn about. And so then if I really think about the horizon in my field, I think what you get right now is that these bacteria live in these wonderful, amazing messes of communities, right? And they communicate with chemicals, right? And at least at the minimum, they can tell self, they can tell related, and they can tell not related. We know that. right? The horizon and what we've discovered in the past couple of years is that this is not restricted to bacteria. It spans all domains on life and also some domains that aren't even alive. What we've learned in the last couple of years is that higher organisms like your cells, the cells in your body, make molecules that bacteria interpret, right? So presumably beneficial or hostile, your body is participating in these conversations and either trying to force bacteria to do certain things or force them not to do certain things. And if I were really able to put, these organisms on the right size chart, this eukaryote would be way, way over there, right? We eukaryotes are closer, our genomes, our human genomes are closer to that of a yeast or an amoeba than they are to a bacterium, right? This is billions of years apart. And yet it is clear now that our bodies are using these chemical words and that we are communicating for good or for bad with these bacteria that inhabit us. And then going even further, we learned this last year that viruses, which are, you know what viruses are, everybody does now, right? So bacteria also get infected with viruses. They are bombarded by parasites. So sort of the parasite of the parasite, we now know that these viruses, which aren't even living organisms, right? They are parasitic machines. They eavesdrop on quorum sensing and they use that information to optimize transmission to new victims, right? So if I could put everybody on the same slide, these viruses in evolution would be buildings away. And yet now we understand that all domains of life and non-life, right, are using quorum sensing to interact. So these chemical mechanisms. And then I'll finish my talk by saying, so that's what we learned in our basic studies, right? So these bacteria communicate, they tell self from other, they carry out collective behaviors. Those behaviors are being disabled and manipulated all the time. And if they can do it, the bacteria can manipulate and disable, we can do it, right? And so what I haven't told you is that quorum sensing controls virulence and biofilms, right? So when bacteria make a person sick, it's not like a couple bacteria get in there and they dribble out some toxins, right? Your immune system would beat them down. What they do is they wait, they count themselves, they recognize when they have the right number, and then they launch these attacks together. And so just like the bacteria and these viruses are manipulating quorum sensing, the state of the art of the field is for us to manipulate quorum sensing, is to take what we're learning from our basic studies, use that what biology has given us as our inspiration and tinker with those kinds of mechanisms in order to make strategies, new medicines, right, that we hope will make people healthier by either making anti-quorum sensing molecules or pro-quorum sensing molecules exactly the way these bacteria are already doing, right? So they're giving us the roadmap and we're trying to follow it and make those into real world applications. So then just to finish, I hope what you think now is that bacteria can communicate and their words are chemicals. Those at a minimum allow them to distinguish self from other. It allows them to have collective behaviors. We think that was the first step in multicellularity. And so that the principles for how multicellularity works, those are all embedded in these bacteria. For sure, both cooperation and competition can occur. And then I've shown you that cheating and trickery and free riding, all occur. And then I want to really distinguish my talk from Dr. Chomsky's. What's funny about or interesting about these words being chemicals is that they exist, right, as physical, animate things. It's not like there's 500 ways to say hello. These chemicals are very specific, and you can't just say, oh, I didn't say that, or you misinterpreted me, because the molecules exist as entities that are specific. So there's something really different about communication, obviously the way humans do it and the way bacteria are doing it. And then, of course, the final thing that I'd like to say is that we think that communication transcends all boundaries of domains, starting with these chemicals from billions of years ago. So that's it.
We'll have questions. Can I ask you one question? And that is, in terms of quorum sensing, these bacteria are accumulating more and more bacteria until they think they have the ability to penetrate a cell or whatever it might be. Can they not do it?
No. So they can't. Well, so we haven't discovered quorum sensing in every species of bacteria yet. So there may be bacteria that don't have quorum sensing, right? Because we're not done, right? But when the molecule, if they're doing quorum sensing and the molecules are accumulating, they don't have free will, right? They have to follow the vote, right? As far as we can tell, right? So because if you didn't do it, that makes you a cheater, right? Like what would be really, really great is for me to make the molecules and let you make all the public goods and I just go along for the ride, right? But there's all kinds of mechanisms to eliminate, some I showed you, cheaters, to punish guys that don't go along with the vote. Because then the whole thing breaks down, right? It's a tragedy of the commons. There, I'm trying to fit in. Yeah, right?
We had that earlier in the semester.
Yeah.
Questions from
Oh, yeah, I should undo that, right? Right, thank you. I'm going to stop my screen share and let those people be back. Yeah.
Professor Chomsky, do you have a question for Professor Bassler?
Just fascination.
Okay, yes.
Hi, Professor. I was wondering, I don't know if you were already commenting on this with Professor Cole's question.
You can take your mask off.
Oh,
for asking the question.
thank you. I was wondering if you could speak to the extent to which selflessness on the part of the individual bacteria is essential for all of the quorum sensing purposes, both in the context of not, it seems to me that like the idea is that the species has to continue on. And so all of the mechanisms that develop are for the sake of the species continuing on, even if it means the guarantee that the individual generation or bacteria will die off. And then similarly, I know you were talking, I couldn't tell if you were talking only specifically about cheating between different species of bacteria or within the same group.
Right. So I'll try and take them in order. We don't think this is altruism. They would kill each other if they could, right? But sometimes you can't succeed or thrive if you don't act as a group, right? Like the example is lots of times bacteria they eat, let's say they eat tree bark, right? It's too big for them to get the nutrients. So they have to put an enzyme out that digests it into tiny soluble pieces, and then they can take those up, right? And so those enzymes only, if I dribble out as an individual a couple molecules of that, it doesn't do any good. It's only when the group does it together the task becomes successful. And so we think that, so it's not altruism, right? They participate, this is sort of the same question, because they have to, because then the community thrives. And you're right that somebody may lose out, right? But bacteria, when they're within the species, they are clones, right? So if I die and you live, I lived because your genome is identical to mine. So I don't want to anthropomorphize too much. They don't think about it the way we do, right? Like I care very deeply whether it's me or my sister. I do, but they're the same, right? And so if one of them survives, they do asexual division, the whole species just survived, right? And so it's not altruism, right? But it is about the group succeeding. And it's just evolution. They wouldn't do group tasks if they didn't do better. They make more progeny when they do group tasks. So that was the first question. And then the second question, I think they're related, right, is that as far as we can tell, the cheating, the trickery, the free riding, right, happens not within the species, right? So they're all for one, one for all, but it's across the genera and across species where all this cheating comes in. Now they can get mutations. This is Jonathan's question. They can get a mutation, like if I, as an individual, don't have the receptor for the molecule, right, on my surface, so I can't detect it, I become a cheater, right? So by mutation, but then there's all kinds of ways that those cheaters are punished and disabled from participating, right? So that they make fewer progeny and quorum sensing continues.
Hi, Professor. So I'm quite interested. Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm quite interested to know whether or not this bacteria, because we talk about the self a lot, right? Whether or not these bacteria have any sort of intermingling amongst each other that, like human societies, where we have different individuals coming together, and there is a multicultural aspect to it, and also intermarriages, etc. Is there something like that in the bacterial world as well?
Absolutely. So in these communities, they can be single species communities. We know sometimes those exist, and they can be, in your words, multicultural, where hundreds or thousands of species of bacteria exist together, right, in a community, right? And they specialize and they do exchange products, they exchange molecules, they can help each other compete, and they can cooperate, depending on who's there. And so I think that is the idea of this multiculturalism. And again, it allows them to specialize, right? Because I have, my genome, and I can carry out X number of tasks. You have some flourishes that I can't do. I have jobs that you need done. And so those kinds of things, we see that happening, right? Where then the bigger consortium actually benefits even better if I collaborate with you who are not my kin, right? So that certainly happens. And then absolutely. So there's all kinds of sex where they're exchanging DNA, which is how you get new flourishes and get diversity. And so some species can exchange DNA across species. Others will take up naked DNA. They'll actually kill the other guy and take up the DNA, and then they incorporate new genes. And this is how you get diversity happening. And so it happens both ways, one by actual mating, and exchanging DNA, and the other by scavenging genes from the environment and putting them into your own genome, trying them out, seeing if you get a benefit, and then keeping them or not keeping them. So both those things happen.
Did you want to follow that up?
Just a quick follow-up is, you talked as well about the anti-quorum sensing medication. Do you think that this intermingling between bacteria could have, a sort of a negative impact on your efforts to, get rid of this quorum sensing?
Yeah, so we're going to go for the interspecies molecule, the molecule that's broad, right? Because we think that has the biggest chance of affecting the most bacteria, right? And so there's sort of different strategies. Like when you're sick with a particular pathogen, you want a narrow spectrum, you go after that species molecule, and it's like a laser, right? You just stop quorum sensing in that species. And there's other cases where your physician doesn't know what you have, and so you want a broad spectrum antibiotic. And in that case, you try to interfere with the broadest communication molecule, which would be the third one on my slide, the interspecies molecule. And so there's different diseases or different strategies that you would take depending on what a person is ill with.
I think one of our guests, art historian David Freeberg, is going to ask another question.
Noam Chomsky. I mean, I see it kind of mistily there, but then I see you have something amazingly in common. And this I don't speak as a scientist, but so you gave an enchanting talk. You gave this enchanting talk on the basis of investing these poor bacteria with in a way, it's exactly the opposite of Chomsky. You invested them with all these charming, in order to tell us what you're doing, you invested them with all these charming human characteristics. You sort of personified them. And this came across, and I used to write a lot about in my episodes as a historian of science, I used to write a lot about anomaly in natural history, biological anomaly, or at least botanical anomalies. And anomalies, unusual monstrosities, as they call them. And I suddenly remembered that one of the most important tactics of the 17th century accounters of biological anomaly was to see their work So we go back to the 17th century. This is really the point of my intervention. We back in the 17th century again. I never thought I would heroize the 17th century, but here we go. May have also been in the 16th century. What did you do with the problem of biological anomaly in the 17th century? You approached it from in two directions. One was the natural philosophical dimension, which is, of course, the scientific dimension, and the other, which made it accessible to ignorant people like most of us, or ignorant of the sciences, was to engage in what they call the poetic dimension. And I think what you have shown this afternoon is exactly what they would have done in the 17th century. This was not what I would call a scientific account of your work, but a poetic account of your work. And in the eyes of the exponents of these efforts at explanation, both were equally valid. So thank you for that return to the 17th century once again.
Yeah, so thank you. And so I worry a lot about, I don't think they have consciousness. It's biochemistry,
No,
period,
not.
right? But I don't think you guys want. Yeah, but I don't think you want to look at all the molecules and rate constants and proteins, right? And so I do think, though, that that we can explain these things with incredible molecular detail, right? And even I find that kind of boring, but in the end, I'm trying to think, and again, you're right about me personifying it, about the motivations, right? These bacteria are trying to solve problems, right? In the end, and they do it with molecules, we do too, I think, right? And so I'm hoping, and I think that was a compliment, but I'm not sure. I'm hoping that it made it so that you, so that you can understand it. And you don't need the gruesome details, right? Because they're just solving problems that are the same ones that groups solve. As soon as there's, goodies to be had, there's cheating, and the bacteria invented or evolved cheating 4 billion years ago, right? And anyway, yeah, so thanks.
So, cheating was, of course, the trope that they all used, jokes of nature, tropes. This was the only way for accounting for the unaccountable, and especially unaccountable exceptions, of which we find, as you know, tons of cases in which the quorum doesn't work out, and you can have all kinds of strange behavior. Thank you so much. No, it was really engaging.
Akeel, I think you had a question.
Yeah, I somewhat different angle on the relation between what you're saying, Bonnie, and what you're saying. A slightly different way of joining the two of you. One way to resist what Chomsky was saying is to say that there's a difference between the gravitational, when he was talking about Newton, and the mental, right? So he was trying to say that the concept of the body has been, as traditionally understood, has been undermined and so on. So one way of resisting that is to say there's a difference between the gravitational and the mental, in that gravitational, properties of matter go all the way down in the universe, whereas the mental is restricted to things with central nervous systems and so on. But if you're right, and there are very complicated systems with this kind of spook in them, the communicative things and that kind of, so some analogy to the central nervous system is there, and it goes all the way down. So this is a way of resisting this objection to Chomsky. Does that make
a little bit? So for sure, to your point, if I actually showed you these receptors and how they work exactly the way they work in the central nervous system, the 2 hits to the detector, right? But of course, because we evolved from bacteria, so the skeletons of those systems are there. But what I want to be really careful that we have never discovered yet in bacteria, it's not a conversation yet where I say something and you say something different back to me. That's not what they're doing, as far as we can tell, right? And maybe that exists. I would love to discover such a thing. But I think that I don't want to embed them with consciousness. I don't think they have it. I don't think they're intelligent. I think they're measuring these chemicals and then behaving because they get to make more babies, right? If they go along with the group. But I do think that when you actually look at the molecular mechanisms for how, not how we evolved language or intellect or humanity, whatever, but the molecular ways those things that we understand work, they're the same, right? You know, the way you metabolize glucose is the way a bacterium, right? The way your immune cells count, it's with quorum sensing, right? You know, that's how antibodies get counted in your body. And so I do think that the principles for at least the molecular, the molecular mechanisms are going to be analogous. You know, we just have more slop, more bells and whistles, right? You know, than these bacteria do.
We're almost out of time, and I regret that because I'm absolutely sure we could go on for another hour or so, but I don't want to keep anybody here very long. But I wanted to ask one question, perhaps if Professor Chomsky and maybe Bonnie can also add something to this. I was taken, of course, as many have, on your distinction between problems and mysteries. And I'm wondering whether or not there is, let me say, are examples of mysteries that have turned out to be problems and problems that have turned out to be mysteries. If there are these transformations over time, then isn't it incumbent for us to pursue all the mysteries because they may just become problems?
Well, very briefly, my understanding of the difference is that these are just properties of organisms. That's why I want to make sure that the concept, problem, and mystery is organism relative. So what's a problem for an infant, a human infant, is a mystery for an ape. They can't do what a human infant can do in things like acquisition of language. I think it's been demonstrated very clearly. Now, since this is an empirical claim, of course it can be shown to be false. Any statement that we make about the empirical world is, we can't propose with certainty. It's been understood since the collapse of Cartesian fundamentalism, foundationalism in the 17th century. It's been understood that there's no certainty in the empirical world. We can only look for the best theory we can, and we'll often find that it was wrong. We have to retract and do it differently. That's scientific progress. And that could, as to get to your question, could happen with these empirical assumptions. And there have, in fact, been plenty of cases where what seemed to be problematic turns out to be mysterious, and conversely. So it was thought for a long time that it would be possible to train apes to acquire language, that the language was just a problem for them. But by now, I think there's overwhelming evidence that it's a mystery, just as the navigational capacities of the ants in my backyard are a mystery for me. I can't carry out those computations, but we could always be wrong about this.
Are there any other questions you would like? There's somebody who's dying to ask a question, even though we're out of time. Well, okay. I just want to really thank Professor Chomsky and Professor Bassler for joining us for this very, very interesting set of talks and leaving us with an awful lot to think about. So, Noam, thank you so much for joining us. And Bonnie, of course, thank you for coming from Princeton to talk with us. And hope you all stay safe and well. And we'll hopefully see you soon. Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, John et al.
Okay, I'll take off. I can clear it now.
I don't know. Is this being this one? Yeah. Yes.
It's a very, very special circumstance. I'm tutoring for a class that is right before this class, and our students